Welcome back into the Lions 24/7 podcast. I am Tyler Donahue, coming to you from Happy Valley, where the spring practice schedule and the spring transfer window have collided. Much like programs across the college football universe, Penn State, James Franklin and his staff trying to navigate the next 9 to 10 days as they get to the blue-white game, while also trying to keep their roster intact as best they can. And of course, monitoring all the players from other programs who are entering the portal at this time of the year. We're going to break down a few changes that are going to directly adjust the Penn State depth chart moving forward, and we'll talk a little bit about what we witnessed and heard on the practice field during our weekly visit on Tuesday afternoon and into the evening. Of course, by now, if you're over at Lions247.com, you've had a chance to read both of our practice notebooks on offense and defense observations. Got a chance to watch almost a 4-minute video highlights from Mark Brennan, and then our photographer, Grace Brennan, as usual, has a comprehensive photo gallery up over at Lions247.com. After practice, we heard from James Franklin, multiple coaches, multiple players. Been a lot to learn about these Nittany Lions this week. We'll do our best to bring a lot to you on this episode of the podcast with Mark Brennan and Daniel Gallen right now. Fellas, welcome back. And as I said, week 4 of spring ball has been pretty enlightening, not just for what we know about the Nittany Lions right now, but what this roster might look like come late August into September. And we'll begin with the obvious, Mark. This is not convenient for James Franklin or really anyone else across college football. The fact that Penn State has this spring transfer window, it's going to open and it's going to close. It opened on Tuesday or on Wednesday. It's going to close next Friday. And then on Saturday, we'll be back in Beaver Stadium to watch Penn State finish out its spring practice schedule. Very bizarre circumstances we're witnessing unfolding in college football right now.
Yeah, first of all, I want to wish everybody a happy Easter, Passover, whatever you're celebrating. Tyler, you have kind of an aura about you. I don't know if you realize with the lighting behind you.
I'm turning 37 on Saturday, so that's probably
that could be it.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, it's insane. I mean, why the NCAA decided to do this, I'll never know. I think it's an instance where they didn't communicate with the people who are actually involved. And to put programs in this, it takes you back to when they opened the portal before or during the college football playoffs. And Bo Pribula is put in a difficult situation. So why they would do this, I have no idea. Just makes absolutely no sense. And for coaching staffs that are already dealing with visits, upcoming official visits, NIL, you name it, and not to mention getting the team ready, now you have to deal with all of this stuff. And I think fortunately for Penn State, they're in a relatively good position. You don't want to see kids leave, but it's going to happen. But I don't think they took the kind of hits that some other teams have taken so far.
There have been a few departures, one of which actually was from before the spring portal window because it was someone who's got some graduate eligibility, and that's JB Nelson. We'll talk about him first, Daniel. That's something that popped up last Friday. We had a lot of coverage over at Lions247.com regarding that one. When we were on the practice field last week, JB Nelson was the first left guard involved. We spoke with Phil Troutline, the offensive line coach, after that practice, and he had talked about getting JB a lot of work with the ones, also some work with the twos, as Cooper Cousins, the sophomore, was getting some first-team reps at left guard. It had been Venga Ioane on the right side to that point. Lo and behold, we get back to practice this week. There's some changes, but before we get to them, the fact that JB Nelson has been removed from the equation, he's got some suitors lining up for him. I'd imagine there's going to be a pretty robust market for someone with his experience, with starting reps at the Big Ten level, and he's got that senior eligibility. So the clock is ticking pretty loudly for him to maximize his final year in this level of football. Daniel, what's your initial reaction to JB Nelson being the first name that surfaced as exiting the program, and ultimately what it means for Phil Troutline as he looks at his interior competitions?
I think the last thing that you said about JB Nelson putting himself in a position to maximize this final year of eligibility, I think that's something that really stands out to me because, for some of these guys, it's individual decisions where, they, to a certain extent, they have to do what is right for them. And if you're someone like JB Nelson and you look at the situation that you're in terms of, best case scenario, you end up in a timeshare with, one or two other guys, given what we know Penn State has, how they've used guys in the past, how they feel about some of these guys. And so, if you're JB Nelson and you look at what's out there, I think that you can find an avenue to playing time elsewhere to potentially put yourself in that position for whatever comes next. I do think that, when he announced in January that he was coming back for his 6th year, it wasn't necessarily a surprise, but it was one where, when you weighed it and you looked at how last season went for him, you could say, okay, this could kind of go either way, and you could really understand it. So it wasn't one that really surprised me. I guess I think that the schools that have been reported as being interested in him, Matt Zenitz from 24/7 Sports said that Nelson's looking at visits to Georgia Tech, Virginia Tech, Syracuse, and Maryland in the coming days. I think that's an interesting list. I think that you could view him as a plug and play starter, probably at any of those schools. And he's in an interesting position too when you talk about this era of college football that we're in terms of the COVID years and everything else, where he's a 6-year senior. This is going to be his 4th year in college, in Division I college football. He spent 2 years at Lackawanna. When you talk about plugging in someone on the offensive line, you can plug in someone that might be going up against freshman and sophomore defensive tackles, who is essentially a grown man at this point. So that's something else that I think he is going for him in his market. But we'll see. I think that Penn State remains in a very good place when it comes to their interior offensive line depth. I think Phil Trautwein's earned the benefit of the doubt, and while you hate to lose any bit of depth, I think that Penn State is, at least right now, in a position to weather that.
JB Nelson leaves Penn State without any Lackawanna college representation. It's been a long time since you looked through that roster and didn't see someone out of Lackawanna. Tyrese Mills moved on after this last year after playing some linebacker and safety. He'll finish his career at UConn. We'll keep tabs on where JB Nelson lands. He's a guy who played some tackle, predominantly played guard during his career at Penn State. He was a 4-star prospect coming out of Lackawanna, a guy they really coveted out of the junior college level. Came to campus and ultimately was able to start 8 games at left guard back in the 2023 season. He finished that year sideline, gave Venga Ioane a chance to really grab that position, and he never relinquished it last year. And I think obviously the other part of this conversation, Mark, is Cooper Cousins waiting in the wings and really not waiting so much anymore. He was there with that first team entrenched. Maybe we shouldn't say entrenched yet, but I have a hard time fathoming someone moving him, supplanting him from the starting lineup for the rest of his college career if he is healthy. And so just to kind of bring people up to speed, we saw Venga Ioane back at left guard, which is where we were accustomed to seeing him last year. He was the first man up there. Alex Birchmeier was the next man up at left guard. We have more on him coming later here in the show. And then it was Cooper Cousins as the first right guard, backed up by TJ Shanahan, a redshirt sophomore who made his move from Texas A&M after starting a few games for the Aggies last year. Mark, you've covered a lot of offensive line units here at Penn State during your career. How many guys, if any, have kind of generated this buzz, this excitement, this anticipation on the offensive line before they even got a start?
Yeah, I mean, Stefan Wisniewski was kind of like that, but it's few and far between. I mean, it's just, going back to what Daniel said, when you look at timeshare, I don't think there was any way they were keeping Cooper Cousins off the field. So where were those snaps going to come from? And, Venga to me is an established, potential first team all Big Ten guard. And you have a veteran center in Nick Dawkins. So where were those snaps going to come from? And you also look at a situation where it was just a couple of weeks ago, Trout was saying that Bam Bam Williams and Nolan Rucci are guys who could also play guard. So it's almost as if this depth, you kind of figured something was going to break, and you can't really blame a guy like JB Nelson, can you? I mean, this is it for him. This is his opportunity, so he's going to go try to find somewhere. But no, with respect to Cooper Cousins, and Tyler, you know this, and Daniel, you too, this was before he even got on campus, right? I mean, this was a guy who we saw at camps, who we've seen a lot of linemen at these Penn State camps, and what they put the best ones through. And, I'll go back. I remember we were out on the practice field, and Franklin had him at left tackle, left guard, center, right tackle, right guard, right tackle, one snap after another. This is going 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And just to see how good he was, and he was dominating. And so we kind of had a feel for what he was going to be when he got here. And everybody was talking him up on signing day. And then he gets here early and everybody was talking about him last spring. So I think they're going to be in good shape. But no, with respect to who they've talked about like this coming in, Wisniewski was physically talented and super smart. He still is super smart, but He's probably physically talented too, but he was just like technically advanced for a freshman when he got here. Cooper Cousins, I think, I'm not sure is as technically advanced, but physically, the whole thing is right there for him.
He's physically as advanced as they've seen coming in. And Phil Trautwein talked about that being a bit of a double-edged sword for him, because he said he can use that physicality and aggression to his detriment sometimes on the practice field. And he said as he starts to embrace these refined techniques, and he says it's happening day by day, he will be elite. Phil Trautwein says he will get to that elite status. If you remember last year, I think it was early October, maybe late September. We're talking about very early in this young man's college career. He publicly compared him to two former teammates, the Pouncey twins,
Right.
over with the Florida Gators. Those guys were all Americans for a national championship team. They were first-round picks, and they were multi-time All-Pro selections at the NFL level. So no one has been shy about pointing to Cooper Cousins as the next big thing. Nick Dawkins says he has, quote, seized the moment this spring, particularly here in the last week or so with J.B. Nelson out of the equation. We'll talk a little bit more about this spot because Alex Birchmeier, some things that were said about the redshirt sophomore warrant attention a little bit later. But focusing back on the portal and the departure, that surprised probably the most out of those who have left thus far, Tamir Robinson entered the portal on Wednesday. He's a guy that we heard about last week. I asked him, James Franklin, directly about him, and he essentially said he is on the trajectory that we hoped he'd be when we recruited him. We're going to need a big season out of him. We're going to need to keep building into the summer. We heard from Dejon Lane, a second-year safety with this team, on Tuesday morning. He said, that's my Mike linebacker. He talked about the accountability they all feel when Tamir Robinson's on the field. We got on the practice field later that Tuesday. He wasn't there. By the end of the night Tuesday, we had a strong sense that Tamir Robinson was portal bound, and we ended up talking about it and writing about it yesterday as it happens. And so, Daniel, we've talked a lot about how thin linebacker was last year and how much trouble they could have been in if you lost a Rojas or a King or DeLuca for extended time. Didn't really happen that way. But Tamir Robinson was one of those 3, 4, 5 pieces we've been pointing to and saying this is why depth could be better. This is why you shouldn't really push the panic button at linebacker. And now he's out of the equation.
Yeah, I think that was one that raised some eyebrows, especially when you consider the profile of the type of player that Tamir Robinson was, in terms of someone who was a well-regarded recruit out of the Pittsburgh area, did a lot of really good things in high school, played a lot of different positions, had to come off injury that cost him some time as an upperclassman, and then sort of start the development process. And it's the thing where you go along and you see flashes in terms of what he was doing on special teams, the little glimpses we got of him playing linebacker at different points last year. You could see different things, and then you in your head, and you think about a linear trajectory. Then you think, okay, this year is an opportunity for him to take another step forward in a new scheme with some reps on the table, with Kobe King moving on to the NFL. And so I think that on paper, you could see, where Tamir Robinson fit in, how he fit in. But there are some, I think, extenuating circumstances when you talk about the number of reps that are there. It sounds like Penn State is going to lean on that 4-2-5. And so, you're taking, one linebacker off the field for a significant amount of time. So that puts a little bit of a squeeze on it, considering Tony Rojas and Dominic DeLuca coming back for, years where they're going to have big roles. You think about other people that are on that depth chart where, Keon Wiley was hurt last year. He's someone that is back in the mix now. Anthony Specco was someone that we heard some good things about last year, but it seemed they tried really hard to retain that red shirt for him. Now it can be a full go in whatever you're doing. So, I think that while we talk about the depth, still leaving something to be desired at linebacker, I do think that with what Penn State has, the way that it might fit with what Jim Knowles is going to do on defense, how they're going to deploy their personnel, I think that when you look at it from that perspective, you can see maybe a situation where there is a little bit of a squeeze or something along those lines. So I think it's just an example. And the next guy we'll talk about, I think, fits in that too, where in your mind, I think sometimes fans, it's like you really want these guys to be patient. You really want them to go on that trajectory of scout team to backup to depth to starter. And I think in certain respects that doesn't really exist anymore.
Yeah, you want the Tamir Robinsons of the world to wait their turn. You want the Kobe Kings of the world to stick around for that 5th year on campus. You don't always get your wish as a fan. And I think with Tamir Robinson, and this is something, Mark, where it's a guy that, let's face it, Dom DeLuca and Tony Rojas are your top 2 linebackers as things stand right now. Rojas isn't available right now on the practice field to be full go, but he will be there when it matters most toward the end of the year. And so those 2 guys stand atop the totem pole right now. As Daniel Gallen made a great point of right there, you've got Keon Wiley day by day, hopefully getting stronger, knocking that rust off, gaining distance from missing a year of action. And then Anthony Specca, who was kind of on that fringe of burning his red shirt last year. By all accounts, including Jim Knowles this week, he seems to be really turning the corner and kind of leaving that youth behind him and becoming more of a reliable component of this linebacker room. But at the end of the day, Mark, Tamir Robinson is a guy that kind of felt like the pieces were there, the path was there, where if he sticks around, there's going to be a significant role this year, then maybe a starter role after that. Maybe this is just kind of how college football is going to work now. The clock's ticking louder in people's minds, but you also have to recognize that if the reps aren't there, 30 plus a game, what does that do to somebody's outlook about where they are and what are they willing to kind of exchange in order to get those 30 plus reps a game, which a lot of people are going to view as their ultimate pathway towards getting on the radar for NFL scouts, getting a raise in the NIL circles. And so there's a lot to kind of battle with, a tug of war with, if you're a player in this kind of situation.
Yeah, the other thing is we had a chance to talk to Tamir at the Thon event, and I was struck by how physically impressive he was. Not that I guess he played defensive end some in high school, but you're losing a 245-pound middle linebacker, Mike linebacker, and Kobe King. I don't have Tamir's numbers in front of me. I'm at my alternate podcasting location, but he had to be a 240-pounder, right? I mean, he was right.
I think he was at 231.
Right.
6'3", 231.
I'm telling you, he looked bigger than that to me. But still, I think if you look at the other linebackers, whatever their weights are, he's like the most physically of the guys who have been in the program, kind of put together and look like a kind of a run stuffer that Penn State would need at times. And as I look at a potential problem there, that to me, would be it. Could a LeVar Arrington Jr. or the second become that person? Sure, but that's a lot to ask of a true freshman. I don't care if you have a 1 linebacker system. If you only have 4 scholarship linebackers who aren't freshmen and one of them is out until preseason camp, that's the potential to be an issue. I mean, they're going to have to be real careful about what they're doing there and figuring things out in the preseason. And you really wonder how hard they may be looking at linebackers in the portal at this point. Maybe get a veteran who could come in and serve as a bit of a leader and a stabilizing force there. But yeah, Tamir, I think he was poised to be a guy, and you talked about it. I mean, players were talking about it, coaches were talking about it, Franklin talked about it. I think he was kind of poised to be a guy who really took a step forward. So this puts, I don't want to say pressure, but it's an opportunity for Keon Wiley. It's an opportunity for Specca. They're 2 of the guys that Knowles mentioned by name when we had an opportunity to talk to him Tuesday. I don't think Dan Connor has any eligibility left. I think if he did, he would be a good fit.
Last August, the word we were getting on Tamir Robinson suggested he might be the next linebacker up off the sideline after those primary 3 that we knew they were going to be dealing with. And he ends up leaving the first game early down at West Virginia, banged up a little bit, and ultimately just gets to 100 total snaps over the course of the rest of the entire seasons on defense. A lot of work on special teams, but it ended up being Elsdon as the next man up, and they really didn't go to the next man at linebacker much. So you can imagine there may have been some frustration for Tamir Robinson going into this offseason. Maybe he didn't feel like it was trending in the right direction with what his role might look like, and decided that now was the time to make a move. It leaves
one thing. Could you mention? You talked about this. You wrote about this. I mean, he was a guy who was at the front of every drill. I mean,
yeah, he was.
Yeah,
last week he was leading the linebacker.
Yeah, this wasn't some slacker. I mean, this is a guy who was working from the outside looking in, and from what we heard from everybody, this was a guy who was getting after it. So, and I just think it's important to note that, because sometimes when kids leave, people are like, well, whatever was going on. This was a guy who was working hard, and when we had an opportunity to talk to him, really carried himself extremely well. So. Yeah. It stinks to see him leave from Penn State's perspective, but you do wish him the best of luck.
A couple names we didn't mention at linebacker to monitor. Kari Jackson missed last year due to an injury in preseason camp. He's a redshirt sophomore. He's more of that bigger, physical, north-south type linebacker, though he's gotten more athletic since coming to campus. And then I know everyone wants to focus on LeVar Arrington II, but I encourage you maybe to check back in on his progress next spring or into the fall a little bit because of where he is physically. I think in that freshman class, Alex Taish may be more suited right now to play a role for you, whether it's special teams, linebacker, when you're trying to see some of the young players in that room. Physically seems to be in a good spot, had some injury issues coming out of high school. So if he can avoid a recurrence there, he is another name to know. Let's get to the third scholarship player who entered the portal. We should mention walk-on linebacker Beckham D. also entered the portal on Wednesday, a guy that we weren't really chalking up to be an important part of the depth chart. But as James Franklin says, they want to have a competitive group of walk-on players. That's going to be threatened a little bit by the new roster structure in the NCAA, and D moves on. Maybe he'll get a scholarship at a lower level. John Mitchell, though, is a guy who, as a redshirt freshman, falls into a different category, I guess you could say. We weren't saying he was going to be a starter. We weren't saying he was going to be an obvious two-deep component. It was more of a wait your turn and then step up at cornerback. That's kind of been the plan for those guys in that room for a while. Yes, you'll get a Kalen King that pops up as a freshman, but a lot of it has been kind of that meritocracy of waiting for the guys to go to the NFL. Then you go to the next step of that ladder. Ultimately, John Mitchell, who was a top 24/7 recruit out of Jacksonville, Florida, a couple cycles ago, he's going to explore other options for his second year at the college level. He was involved in that fifth defensive back conversation, playing some slot. Still think that King Mack and Zion Tracy are the two guys to really know there, but they haven't been available on the practice field. So we saw Mitchell getting some work. And Daniel, this is somebody who came up with his high school teammate, Antoine Belgrave Shorter, who's now working at safety and doing some good things there. But we really had him pegged as a third stringer and a special teams component this year. And as I said, that's been a pathway towards success for cornerbacks as they've grown up in Terry Smith's room. But not everybody is going to be, buying into, 3 or 4 year plan for whatever reason. Proximity to campus, to their hometown, opportunities they may perceive are elsewhere right now on another campus. And ultimately, it adds up to John Mitchell leaving town pretty early in his career.
Yeah, when you look at Mitchell, he's another one of those guys that fits the vision that you have for a guy's trajectory, where we knew what was ahead of him last year, and we didn't expect to see a lot of him. And you look at when he got in the games and how his season went, and you can see maybe the profile of a little bit of an ascending player, where he makes his college debut against Kent State in that blowout. He doesn't play again until the Purdue game, I believe. Plays in the Maryland game, and then you get to the playoff and the postseason where these games don't matter anymore, don't have to worry about retaining a red shirt, and he plays in every single postseason game on special teams. He had the onside kick recovery against SMU in that game, and I talked to him at the Fiesta Bowl, and I talked to Jalen Reed, and then later Antoine Belgrave Shorter about something that that onside kick, it was 28-0. SMU kicks a surrender field goal to make it 28-3. We all initially thought it was Anthony Ivey, getting it when we were in the press box. Like, it's something that I think flew under the radar a little bit. Penn State did make him special teams player of the game for that. But, in talking to Mitchell in Phoenix, and then talking to Jalen Reed and other people, like, that's the type of that means something to a player like that, to have that opportunity. And so I was really struck by, Mitchell, going through a redshirt year where he's not playing a lot. And if he's playing, it's mostly on special teams, having this little moment and then having that be his confidence booster going into the offseason moving forward. So this is another one where you understand it, I think, when you look at all of the mechanics involved, especially what would be ahead of him. You mentioned that fifth defensive back spot. It remains to be seen whether that, fifth DB, is it going to be a safety like King Mack? Is it going to be a corner like Zion Tracy? Where will that come from? What are the rotations going to look like? I think Terry Smith made it pretty clear who those top three outside corners are. And then you can extrapolate to a little bit of, we probably know who those top two slot players are going to be with Tracy and King Mack. And you can maybe see the playing time, dry up a little bit with where things are. And so we'll see where Mitchell lands. He's one where I'm really curious about it, given his recruiting pedigree and given where he's from in terms of being from the South. I know that he had a ton of offers coming up through the high school ranks. And, you know that programs keep tabs on these guys, after the recruiting process. James Franklin talks about it all the time. So we'll see where he resurfaces. But, I think that, it's one of those things where you understand, like you can see it with someone like JV Nelson, and to an extent with someone like Tamir Robinson, in terms of where they are, in terms of their clock, in terms of their careers, where they are. When you see it with Mitchell, especially given what Terry Smith has done at the cornerback spot, maybe this is one where you're kind of like I don't quite understand it as much. But it's, we'll probably say it a million times, like it's the nature of the portal. It's the nature of the game right now. And so, Penn State, they've recruited, I was looking at it, they got a lot of cornerbacks coming in this summer. Darius Dixon's already here. You got, a pretty solid top 3 guys plus Zion Tracy. So they're going to be fine. But, we know how quickly depth can disappear. We know that sometimes guys aren't ready when you think they might be. Guys are all on different timelines. And so you want as many people as you can going through your program, because they can all help. And, John Mitchell is going to be doing that somewhere else.
It would not be a surprise if this room, if among the top 6, only half of them are still on campus next year because of opportunities at the next level. We saw that happen last year where Penn State lost 3 starting cornerbacks. They were able to counter that with some transfer pickups and get through it, looking really well along the way. Kenny Woosley, who I mentioned before, redshirt freshman out of Philadelphia, is a guy that you should definitely know, kind of beyond those top 3 or 4 players who've done it in games. And as Daniel mentioned, Darius Dixon is someone who showed up on campus mentally and physically prepared for the moment, based on the accounts from this Penn State staff. He comes from a high level of program out in Southern California, Mater Dei, and there's a lot of people who think he can be day one ready. And so that's kind of what you're looking at now in the lower rungs of the cornerback room on the depth chart. And we'll continue to monitor the transfer portal in the days ahead. It's open until next Friday. As I mentioned, the day before Penn State gets into Beaver Stadium for its blue-white game, the portal will close. And just a kind of reminder of how different this scenario was just last year. Penn State played its blue-white game on April 13th last year, so almost 2 full weeks before they will play this time. And that spring window opened after the blue-white game. So it was a much different situation to play out. And before we switch gears, what was your general takeaway, Mark, from hearing James Franklin talk about his approach internally this week with his team, and ultimately some big picture takeaways where he talked about maybe the direction college football needs to be moving?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with him. He had mentioned, for people who missed it, that he would prefer, and I think he was speaking on behalf of a lot of coaches. He said he wasn't, but I think he is. Having one window at some point. I mean, this is just untenable. I mean, it's a difficult situation where he said it, nobody's winning. I mean, this doesn't help the kids. What is Mitchell going to do? I wish him nothing but the best of luck. Like, JB Nelson is going to be okay because he's a proven starter. Nobody knows anything about John Mitchell. And so now he's going to arrive at another school in the summer. And how difficult is it going to be? But if he didn't see a path to playing time here, it's just a difficult situation. So I don't know when it should be, but I think you have one portal window. And if somebody can't commit to being with you for 1 year, it just doesn't seem to make sense to me. So to me, that would be the way to go. You don't want to prevent kids from doing it, because I think we've seen that it's benefited certain players, but you also don't want to make it so easy that guys are hopping around every single year. So I would limit it to one. I think that was the best thing. And I do think that they've had a pretty good, if you look overall, they're losing a kid here or losing a kid there, but generally speaking, they've done a good job at maintaining the best players in the program. And I think that speaks to culture. I think it's more about, money's obviously part of it. They have enough money to pay people now, but it's the culture. They have to want to be here, because if you don't want to be there, you're going to be able to get the money somewhere else. So I think overall they're doing a good job with it. And I think he's handled himself pretty well, dealing with his, so far to date, the biggest big name players. When you look around the country and see some of the things that are happening, it's a little bit troubling. And I don't know that anybody's to blame other than the NCAA for having these windows at the times that they're having them.
Yeah, I would say a couple things on top of that. We've acknowledged this before, but Penn State's at an elite level right now in roster retention, which is a really important part of the process for college football. Maybe not an elite level when it comes to transfer talent acquisition right now, but there's a different approach to building a program, and they consider themselves, what James says, to be a developmental program. That's going to be their primary focus. And I think the other thing on top of that is when you realize all the money that's around and all the conversations that are being had. And this week of all weeks, we're hearing so much noise out of Tennessee with their former 5-star quarterback and that how that's all fallen out. We don't hear a peep really about these negotiations that take place between the players and whoever's actually making the final NIL decisions on Penn State's end. I think that's a great thing. I think there's a lot of trust on both sides of the bargaining table right now. And it also indicates that you don't have some power plays being made within this roster at inopportune times. If that's happening, we're not hearing much about it. But I think that's also good because you hear a lot of crumbles, a lot of nuggets from other programs, other campuses right now about some really shady situations happening. And you've also got guys who changed teams during the winter transfer portal. 3 months later, they're changing teams again. They're entering the portal 3 months later. So it's a mess out there. And so far, Penn State's been relatively messy. We'll see if that lasts for another
Tyler,
week.
one other thing, if I could. I mean,
yeah,
we talk about the culture, and I think the perfect example is King Mac, right? A guy who thinks there's a better opportunity somewhere else. It doesn't work out and ends up coming back and is welcome back. It's like he never left. Everybody loves him. So it's not perfect, obviously. They're going to lose people, and at some point they're going to lose a big name. I don't know when it would be, next year, 2 years from now, whenever it may be. But overall, when you look at King Mac going to a program like Alabama, deciding it's not for him and deciding to come back, I think that is example A for Penn State.
Yeah, James talked about that. Said he stayed in touch with guys in his class, guys in the room, probably realized he could have been part of a developmental push in year 2 at Penn State, and then decided it was where he wanted to be. Yeah. Daniel, just really quickly, you wrote about this on the eve of the signing portal, or not the signing portal, geez, mixing two things, the transfer portal opening up this week. James Franklin's mission statement essentially was he wanted no surprises in this 10-day window. Again, I think Tamir Robinson, a surprise for many of us. Now, in retrospect, I wonder if he wasn't so superfluous in his praise of Tamir, because maybe he knew this is a guy who was having some concerns or having some second thoughts about his decision to remain with Penn State moving forward. Regardless, though, I don't think this was a huge bombshell for James Franklin, considering we knew about it on Tuesday. So it sounds like he's just trying to get this through this thing without any bombs going off alongside him that he didn't see coming.
Yeah, I think that this goes back to what Franklin has talked about for a while in terms of having communication. I know that he makes the jokes about him being an over communicator when it comes to certain things. And I think that in that building, I think that a lot of people know exactly where they stand. They know exactly what their situation is. And I think that plays into it. And I think that is also where Franklin is coming from when he's talking about no surprises, is that he wants to know what all of his players what they're thinking, and then he wants them to know what he's thinking. An interesting conversation with Stan Drayton, the new running backs coach, on Tuesday night about it, and he said that Franklin is really blunt. That was the word that he used to describe it, and he said that really helps in the building in terms of in terms of where people know where they stand, things like that. Drayton said that on a personal level, he enjoys it because when he goes to work every day, he knows what the situation is, and there's no surprises. Like he said that other places he's worked, you show up and it's kind of like, oh, like this is different, this is new. I wasn't expecting this, and so yeah, I think that Franklin has done a nice job of building this program in a certain way. I think that you look at different things that have happened at Penn State over the past couple of years. Maybe there's a sliding door where if they're not behind on NIL from the jump, if they are at the cutting edge, maybe things look a little bit different. That's something that has stood out to me because we've heard about how they're behind. Now they might be catching up, and potentially that alters their strategy. Johnny McGonigal from Penn Live had a story today. He asked Franklin about it, where they're the only power team that has not taken a quarterback transfer. And you look around the country at so many quarterbacks on the move, things like that. And Penn State has had relatively uninterrupted since 2016, from McSorley to Clifford to Aller, and having stability at a position like that, while it's only one position. And, I remember probably my first Franklin media availability ever in 2021. I think he said he'd be open to adding a transfer quarterback just because they only had 3 scholarship guys on the roster. But I think even having stability at a position like that, I think that has an effect on your program in terms of, who the leaders are, how this program is really being driven. And so I think that there's a lot of I think that Penn State is an interesting case study in terms of how to handle this era, what they're doing, and also how they're having success with it. When you look at their run over the past couple of years and then making it to the CFP semifinals earlier this year, it's interesting. And I think that Franklin, whether it was how he wants to do things, in his heart, whether it was the circumstances when this new era, really got rolling a couple of years ago, they've decided to do things this way. And it's a little bit unique and it's working for them. And so I think that that's a testament to Penn State and to Franklin right now.
We will flip this conversation next week. We'll get Tyler Calvaruso on, our resident transfer portal and recruiting insider, and we'll talk about a little bit where Penn State could be looking to add some talent moving forward as they move beyond the spring window, try to prepare for preseason camp. Remember, guys like Chop Robinson, Hunter Norzad, they were additions who came on board after spring ball. So this may not be a complete roster. We know it's not a complete roster because there's a remaining freshman group still to come to campus. But in terms of experienced college talent, they still may be looking around. They are still looking around, and we'll let you know where they might be looking at lions247.com every step of the way. 50% off for a full year of VIP access, or $1 for 1 month through the end of spring ball here. Let's focus on a few takeaways from our trip to the practice field this week. And it was our first chance to hear from Jim Knowles, since he actually got some practice experience under his belt as a Penn State defensive coordinator. Of course, we got his introductory press conference back in the winter. But Mark, you were front and center there with Brennan Cam. We've got the full video over at lions247.com. Generally, what stood out from your time with Jim Knowles, who, as we've heard from James Franklin, as we've witnessed ourselves, approaches practice life a little differently than anyone we've seen filling that role for the Nittany Lions?
A man of few words. I mean, it was cool. I was shooting the defensive backs, intercepting passes over their shoulders, and this figure comes walking into the shot, taking notes, and it was Jim Knowles. So, I asked him about that, and he said he likes to observe, take notes. He organizes the practice plan ahead of time and lets the other assistants execute it. And it speaks to the just the confidence he has in the rest of the staff. So I really enjoy talking to him. He's just so low key, but looks you straight in the eye, and then was kind of walking into people a little bit, and not in a bad way, but just carried himself in a unique way. You could tell there's a level of confidence there that he knows what the hell he's doing. And just being able to talk to him, you could tell this guy is pretty smart. The other thing they talked about was how much he and Kotelnicki, even though they're vastly different personalities, how they're kind of learning from one another, testing one another out there on the field. So I thought that was cool.
Daniel, in terms of newcomers on the staff, Stan Drayton also fits that description. He got to campus a few weeks after Jim Knowles as the new running backs coach, replacing longtime position leader Jaywan Sider, now at Notre Dame. And Drayton, as we said, it's kind of a luxury to walk into a job where you've got Nick Singleton and Katron Allen waiting at the front door for you. But he said his goal was going to be to find their weaknesses, get them to be where they want to be. He's done it before with guys like Bijan Robinson and Ezekiel Elliott. Now those two step up, but there is a collection of young talent in that room that we know very little about. He's starting to learn more about. What were your takeaways? I know that you dropped a bunch of notes here earlier Thursday in our updates thread on what you heard from Stan Drayton.
Mark talked about Jim Knowles carrying himself with a certain confidence. I think Stan Drayton also carries himself with a level of confidence. It's a little bit louder, I think, when you watch him, coach Singleton and Allen and these running backs on the field. But it was interesting this was my first time hearing him talk an extended period. I was away during his intro presser. And he was someone who, was very thoughtful, had really good answers, offered some insight, and you can tell that he's coaching these guys pretty hard. He said that, he's like, yeah, Nick Singleton and Katron Allen, they still have weaknesses. They still have things that, I'm going to coach them up. I'm going to get them better at. And, he said that, he's seen a lot. He's been around for a while. And so that I think that there's a mutual respect there from these players that, even though he's a new coach, they respect him and they're listening. He was asked generally about the younger running backs on the roster. He didn't single anyone out individually. He did say that they have to develop a number 3 and a number 4 this year. That that's a priority for them, and to get through this season. And then he was asked specifically about Tyke Hayes, the early enrollee from Aliquippa, and he said that Hayes is quote a tough nut, and then said that he's not scared of anything, that there's no fear in him. So we'll see. He said that there's an element where he's one of those guys where he wants it really bad, so sometimes he's trying to do too much, or he's getting himself overwhelmed with what he's doing. But you could tell that I think Drayton has been impressed with him early on. One thing that a common thread in both Knowles and Drayton, I transcribed it from Mark's video where someone asked Knowles, you're around the national championship team last year at Ohio State. Does this team have the it factor? And he said, yes. Next question. Stan Drayton was asked a similar question where he won a national championship at the D3 level at Allegheny College, then won a pair under Urban Meyer at Florida and Ohio State. And so he was asked, do championship teams have a certain feel to them? Is there something that you're feeling now at Penn State that's similar to what you've seen earlier in your career? And he gave a little bit more long-winded answer than Jim Knowles did, but the sentiment was the same, that he can feel that this is a team where they care about each other. They're working hard. They know what their goal is, and they're all pulling in the same direction. And he said that that's a common thread on some of these championship teams that he's been a part of. So I think it's interesting to hear from two guys who, Drayton hasn't even been on the job for 2 months yet. I don't think, and Knowles has been less than 3 months, I think, if I'm reading the calendar right. And so for them to come in and see this early, I think that it reflects well on Penn State. And I think also the feedback that we're getting, from a Singleton, about Stan Drayton, and then the way that some of these defensive players are reacting when you ask them about Jim Knowles. Like Elliot Washington, the cornerback, I asked him, what he thought about this scheme, and he just kind of started laughing. And he said, "I love it. That it's great that they all feel like they're going to be put in the right positions to succeed." I think all of this holistically, how Drayton and Knowles are feeling about the program, how the players are feeling about Drayton and Knowles, I think it really shows that these are two, I think potentially home run hires for Penn State.
I wrote a story last Friday about where Nick Singleton stands and his development, and specifically with Stan Drayton. And I know his rapport with Sider, and between those three, Katron and Jaywan and Nick, was just about as tight as any you'd find in any corner of this roster for the last few years. But he sounds pretty giddy about the opportunity, knowing what the resume looks like for Stan Drayton. We've seen some different drills. There was one where Drayton was rolling this inflatable ball. He didn't quite know where it would even roll and how it would roll. And he told the running backs, "I'm not going to tell you what to do. I want to see you improvise." And that really lines up with what Nick Singleton said is the focus for him is improvisation in the open field, avoiding contact, wherever you got to do it, spin move, jumping over guys, lateral moves, getting to the second level, the third level, and scoring long touchdowns. And Drayton continues to kind of hammer some of that stuff. And circling back to Tyke Hayes, I ended up maybe 2 feet away from him for a moment of practice. Yeah, his lower body is bigger than Nick Singleton or Katron Allen, guys who've been with the program for 4 years. And he's not thin up top either. There's some refinement to go. But I'll tell you what, he pulled a spin move at that size in that drill I was talking about, and there were some audible oohs and ahs from members of the Penn State
We have
staff.
video.
So, yeah, we got video. Yeah, we always have video. Thanks to Brennan,
including the
over at
oohs and
Lions
ahs.
24/7. Yeah, so we got video highlights, pictures, everything over at Lions247.com, and an entire video as well of Jim Knowles' Q&A session. Another
I have one more Stan Drayton thing.
Sure.
He had a pretty funny anecdote about how, similar to what you're talking about with those drills and, helping guys with their vision and things like that, where he said that since he's played the position, he D3 won a national championship, that, guys will come over and say that it wasn't there, I didn't see it or whatever. And he can just say, No, it wasn't. Like, it was there. I saw it. Like, this is what you need to do. So I think,
Imagine the weight that's been lifted off his shoulders from last year. You know what I mean? I mean,
yes.
he just looks like he's so comfortable.
Yeah. You've got Stan Drayton trying to pull the Temple Owls program forward as best he can in year 3, and then he goes into a situation where maybe he's just a missing piece to a national championship program right now. Got to be a very different scenario when he lifts his head off the pillow. Those first thoughts every morning here in Happy Valley. In terms of newcomers, mentioning Tyke Hayes, I also want to get over to Devontae Ross real quick. I'll have a story up on him this week at Lions247.com because James Franklin described, quote, dramatic improvements from Devontae Ross. He specifically pointed to the fact that he is coming from a program at Troy that simply is not going to have the resources on campus and within its facilities that a program like Penn State is going to have. And we remember what he did at Troy, 1,000-yard receiver, all-conference return man, led that entire conference, the Sun Belt, in total yards per game, top 20 in the nation in total yards per game. And Franklin mentioned again, we've seen what he can do in a Big Ten setting. He's mentioned this every opportunity. The trip to Iowa City that Troy made last year when they kind of made things pretty tough on the Iowa Hawkeyes for much of that game. He had 2 touchdown catches. He went over 120 yards receiving, and he took one back to the house as a punt returner. I've mentioned this before. Special teams coordinator Justin Lustig, very high on what they added from a return perspective with Devontae Ross. But James Franklin continues to talk about this young man as though he is taking the steps they hope to see when they brought him up to this level. And he's also saying the combined presence of Kyron Hudson, who came in from USC, different kind of background. He spent several years in a power conference setting, Big Ten last year. But he says those two guys have really raised the standard in this room. And I know everyone's going to say, yeah, right, I don't want to hear about this receiver room until they show up and do things. But we're passing along what we've got. And I would say right now, whether it's on the record or off the record, been very good feedback on both Hudson and Ross. But the Ross stuff has me feeling a little bit buzzier about what he might be able to bring to this team as a playmaker in the open field, as a pass target, as a punt returner. And we added to that on Tuesday, hearing some things and getting over to a relatively young player, but not quite as young as we might think at this point. Year 3 it is for Alex Birchmeier. Came to campus a few years ago as a top 100 overall prospect. Only Javen Williams ranked more highly in that 2023 class in terms of 24/7 Sports ratings. But Birchmeier has been pretty quiet on campus in terms of game action. Less than 40 total offensive snaps to his credit. Got a lot more work on special teams last year than he did on offense. We got to the field this spring. He was kind of working in as a third guard. That situation changes now. He was the second guard up on the left side behind Venga Ioane. And look, Venga Ioane is not going to be leaving the field much, but this is an out-of-conference schedule that we've talked about. It's some cupcake-ish. Let's be honest about it. So there should be chances for a guy like Birchmeier to maybe double, triple his career snap total by the time you get into October because of what may be ahead of you if he isn't that too deep. And I asked specifically to James Franklin about Birchmeier after that Tuesday practice session, and boy, did he give an answer. He gave the light has come on. And I'm telling you, he reserves that for guys who are really about to take a step forward. We heard about Zacchaeus Wheatley last year. He took a huge step. We've heard it in the past. Those guys have taken steps. Now it's Birchmeier's turn potentially, where Nick Dawkins followed up on Wednesday. I had a chance to talk to him as well, said he's coming across as a different person, as a different man, as a different player this year. Drew Shelton says something has been pulled out of him by Phil Troutwine, whether you want to point to aggression, technique. No one could quite put their finger on it, but they say the approach has been different, really starting back late fall into this spring. And now we're going to see what lies ahead for him in the blue-white game and then beyond. But Daniel, you want to talk about someone who needed to answer a bell in this moment for their career, as we're talking about guys in the transfer portal, maybe not making the moves they hoped to on the depth chart. This is perfect timing for Alex Birchmeier and potentially for the Penn State offensive interior.
You talk about Franklin using the light has come on line. He also used the everybody's journey is different line, which is one that we've heard him use a couple times, and I've actually heard a lot of different players use over the course of the past couple of years, and I think that's always something to keep in mind. I know that it's easy when you see the stars next to the name and the recruiting ranking to maybe expect someone to come in right away. And really take to it. But yeah, I mean, if you are, Alex Birchmeier and you're in year 3, I mean, this is kind of when you need to see it, especially given the the reputation that he had as someone who was a little bit more refined, coming in. I've got the 2023 recruiting rankings up right now, and the offensive linemen in this class it's really interesting years for them. When you have Javen Williams, Alex Birchmeier, Chim Diono, all of whom were ranked in the top 150, Birchmeier number 84, Javen Williams number 25, and they're guys that we have not seen that much on the field. Partly it's because Penn State hasn't needed them, given the way the O-line has played and what they've had. But when you talk about getting to the stage in your career, this is where you're looking for those next steps, and everything along those lines. But if Birchmeier is in that position to be that number 3 guard, that number 4 guard, someone that you can confidently rotate in over the course of a game, kind of like what we saw from JB Nelson last year at different points, I think that really does wonders for you, because I'm definitely of the philosophy that you can never have too many offensive linemen, and then it applies to all positions. But I think offensive line is when it can really stand out, is that this depth can disappear pretty quickly. Where you subtract JV Nelson, then maybe there's an injury here, something nagging here. Suddenly things can look a whole lot different. And so you need as many guys ready to play as possible. And if Alex Birchmeier is in that position, he's going to get the chance to play. And then he can be a valuable piece for Penn State. So I think that it was kind of a little bit of a joke sometimes when we do a breakdown of the offensive line, and when's the first comment going to come of where's Alex Birchmeier, where is he at, are we going to see him? I think now we are finally getting some real on the record positive feedback on him, and I think that's a really big positive for Penn State right now.
Birchmeier began his career at Penn State in spring of 2023 playing tackle on the right side for that spring. Phil Trautwein likes to work some of these guys from the perimeter to the interior. He was settled into the guard spot by the end of that freshman year. That's where he'll be competing. And I'm really curious, when we get into Beaver Stadium on April 26th, we get some one-on-one work on the practice field. We get a ton of technical and drill work from the offensive line, but we don't get to see them go play by play on a possession, on a sustained scrimmage possession, battling against the defensive linemen. So it should be enlightening for us to see Birchmeier and a bunch of these other guys, especially since we're not going to see guys like Nolan Rucci, Anthony Donko, and we'll see how much we actually see of the Venga Ioanes and Nick Dawkins and Drew Sheltons of the roster, who've proven it time and time again in Big Ten action. Maybe don't have a ton to prove next Saturday in Beaver Stadium. Max Granville is a guy that we also heard rounding into form. He's a second-year player, a guy that was on the verge of burning red shirt last year, certainly sounded ready to do that if they needed to. Abdul Carter was able to keep playing into the playoffs, so they didn't have to turn to Granville quite yet. But Franklin described him, and later Drew Shelton, who I caught up with and has battled against him a bunch on the practice field, said last year, I don't know if he's a one-trick pony, but it was really about his speed rush as a pass rusher. Now more physically developed, more balanced, can handle himself against the run. Starting to see more of a complete defensive end as a redshirt freshman. We still like Zariah Fisher and deny Dennis Sutton at this stage of the calendar to be the starters at defensive end, but there's a lot of conversation to be had with a lot of unproven talent beyond those guys. Max Granville may lead that list. And I just wanted to throw this your way too. Tysier Denmark, Mark, had a lot of really positive things to say about himself, about where he's at. So take it with a grain of salt, but I think it's good to hear a wide receiver in a Nittany Lions uniform really kind of putting it out there that they think they're going to be a big-time threat. He said he's, really taking no prisoners out in the practice field, and he's trying to dominate. I thought that was really interesting to hear, kind of, very unfiltered. Pure dominance is the description he applied to what he wants to bring to the field. We've heard from some teammates, some players that he is flashing at the very least on the practice field. We expect to see him a lot out of the slot. Tysier Denmark, I thought it was interesting, Mark, said he viewed last year in retrospect as an opportunity to really grow up, watch football. It doesn't seem like he has a lot of regrets about having to watch a ton of football. And I know some fans were wondering, how is nobody breaking through that group when it's not quite productive? And you've seen the same veterans trotted out there time and time again. Well, James Franklin says the time is now for Tysier Denmark. We heard the same thing from his position coach, Marcus Hagans, a couple of weeks ago, and that it needs to happen. No one cares that he's a redshirt freshman, is the way that James Franklin said it. And he also said he can be a big-time player in this league. So a couple second-year players there for you to consider, Mark. Max Granville, Tysier Denmark. I think if both these guys boom, you're talking about new weapons on each side of the ball who are going to be around for a while.
Where's Denmark from?
Philadelphia.
He's got the Philly attitude, man. He's ready. He's ready to get after it. Let's see if he can be consistent and turn it into production. Though, I mean, it's one thing to have the confidence; it's another to go out there and get it done. But it's good to have the confidence. I agree with you. I would rather have somebody be like that than willy nilly and not sure. Granville had an opportunity to talk to him at the Fiesta Bowl. Was it? I'm so lost on what. Wow, did he carry himself unbelievably? And the thing that struck me, he's up to like almost 250 pounds now. So you talk about the physicality. He's just going to keep getting stronger and stronger and stronger. And I think he's actually in a good place, guys, where they don't need him to be the guy. I think he'll be really good as a rotational piece. Remember, this could be his freshman year coming up. I mean, he reclassified and came in early. So I don't think being the third D end, and we know how Deion Barnes likes to run it, very much the way Coach Chaos did back in the day, where you have two maybe primary guys, but you're going to rotate in at least 4 guys, maybe even up to 5. And I think he's going to be a real integral part of what they're doing there. But really impressive kid. But both of those guys, I don't mean to say that Denmark, isn't impressive, because he is. But he flashed in games last year. And, you could get a feel for it, and you could see what he can do at practice. But again, it's a matter of, you touched on it earlier, Tyler, from all these receivers, I don't want to hear about it. I want to see it out on the field. You know what I mean? And not in the blue-white game. It'll be great if they play well in the blue-white game. But going back to a couple years ago, and we've talked about this with the offensive line, they talked and talked and talked until finally Franklin said, we're not talking anymore. You guys are going to see what happens on the field. And they went out and got it done. So is this a group that can do that? Maybe, but we just don't know for sure. So Tysier Denmark, if I can spit it out, Philly kid, is part of that group.
One more second-year player we wanted to finish on, because we also got to hear from him, and we spoke about this, Daniel and I. He came across as a fifth-year senior more than he did a second-year college player, but Dejon Lane, and that's a good thing, because he's going to really need to be a presence for this Penn State defense, it would seem. Whether he's a starter or the next man off the sideline at safety, he's going to play a bunch of football. He got a chance to get his feet wet last year, in part to that KJ Winston injury. Daniel, you were able to put together some notes for Lions247.com. What stood out overall from Dejon Lane, who, again, this could be a next kind of household name if things go according to plan for him in that secondary for Penn State?
When you talk about him carrying himself like a veteran, I thought the one place it really shone through was he got asked to compare himself, to players or who he watches film of, in his spare time. And, he said it's a good question. He thought about it. And then the answer that he landed on is his older brother, Raywon Lane III, who just finished his career at the Naval Academy and has popped up on a couple pre-draft visits the past couple weeks. So, I thought that was, I feel like some guys will say, pick your poison, just any prominent safety, or, Dejon Lane is, from the Baltimore area. So if he'd said like Ed Reed or something like that, you would have been like, oh, okay. Like, but the fact that he went with his brother, who was, playing at Navy, I thought was interesting, and kind of a mature answer there, from him. I think he's an interesting place. Anthony Poindexter made some comments last week that from a physical perspective last year, Lane was probably good to go out there on the field. From a mental perspective, there's probably a little bit of, him being out there before he was quite ready because of the Winston injury. And, Jalen Reed brought it up to me at the Fiesta Bowl that, if you looked at Dejon Lane's playing time and Tyrese Mills' playing time last year, they kind of flipped by the end of the season with Mills seeing a little bit more time out there. So Lane said that last year was humbling in certain respects, but, he feels that he's developed, he feels better. I think that he's in a really good position to be that, second safety out there next to Zachy Wheatley. Wheatley had good things to say about him and where he is in his growth. And so I think that Lane is someone that, responded well, to that failure that he had last year. I asked Elliot Washington about that on Tuesday too, because we saw Washington have some pretty public growing pains during his freshman year. And he said that you lean on the older guys around you. You know that they've been through the same things, and you use that to build yourself forward. And it does seem like that, Lane had the opportunity to be around so many veterans last year that he has really internalized that and is in a good spot to move forward.
If you haven't noticed, we got a lot of different voices coming our way, a lot of different things we're observing. And there's a ton behind the scenes going on at Lions247.com. We give you about 2 hours or so of podcast content each week, but we are 24/7, like it would suggest. We are at that site all the time. Tyler Calvaruso, myself, both Brennans and Daniel Gallen are locked in, and we got a whole nother week of spring ball ahead of us. We've got the whole nother week of the transfer window here in the spring. And oh, by the way, the NFL draft, which means we got to put together our Penn State mock draft, which is always an interesting experiment. We'll bring that to you in podcast form as well next week when we find the time. But for now, stepping aside, Mark, Daniel, appreciate the perspective as always. Encouraging everybody, one more time, I'll mention it this week, 50% off an annual VIP subscription at Lions247.com or $1 for 1 month. Jump on either of those offers through next week and take advantage of what we bring to you on a daily basis. For now, stepping aside on behalf of these guys, I'm Tyler Donahue. This has been the Lions 24/7 podcast.